Good afternoon. We're back with another Marvel Snap video, and today will be a tier list and buying guide for Pool 3 cards in Marvel Snap as of March 6th, 2023. This guide will be intended for players who are new to Pool 3 or early in Pool 3 and looking for different opinions about what cards are strong and worth buying and what cards are not. Now, before making any buying decisions, it's important to go over or to do some introspection about what your goals are in this game. If you don't care whether you get to infinite or not, or you don't particularly care how high you climb on the ladder at this moment in time, I would not recommend really spending your tokens on any cards. I would save them up for the cards which are never going to leave Series 5, which as of right now, that would be Thanos, Galactus, and Kang, because no matter how long you wait, those cards are never going to get any cheaper than they are right now. All of the other cards that are currently in Pool 5 or Pool 4 are going to get discounted at some point. And so the only factor in terms of making buying decisions is how long do you want to wait to get the cards. That will determine whether you save up your tokens or simply spend them as soon as they come in to get whatever Pool 3 cards are of interest to you. But if you're just entering into Pool 3 and you want to climb as high as you can on the ladder right now, then you're probably going to have to spend some tokens, and I'm going to give my opinions about which cards are the best to spend tokens on. And if you're just playing for fun, again, I would advise that you save up your tokens for the cards which are never going to get discounted, and therefore you have to pull them from a cache, which is incredibly unlikely, or you have to spend 6,000 tokens on them. But if your goal is to climb as high as you can right now, well, if you want to make infinite in the first month that you enter into Pool 3, or you want to get as high as you're capable of getting in the first month that you enter into Pool 3, you're going to have to spend tokens or get lucky. So here is our tier list. We're simply going to start in order from least energy cost to most. So the first card up on the list is going to be the Wasp, a 0 cost 1 power card. For each card, we'll go over what decks you typically find this card in and the relative strength of that deck. The Wasp is usually found in 2 decks, that would be Lockjaw and Patriot. In both those decks, the Wasp is a decent card, but not an essential card. It's more essential in Lockjaw than it is in Patriot. In Lockjaw, it's a solid B minus card. I don't know that you could play the Lockjaw Jane Foster variant without Wasp. You really need the 2 0 cost cards. You could conceivably substitute Yellow Jacket, but the deck would get worse. So if you want to play Lockjaw Jane Foster, then you need the Wasp. Now, Lockjaw Jane Foster is not going to be a deck you're going to be able to acquire with the 3,000 tokens that they give you upon entering Pool 3. You're going to need to pull some of the cards from caches or get more tokens first. So I wouldn't recommend Wasp being one of the first cards you buy in early Pool 3. But it's a card to aim for in the future if you want to play Lockjaw Thor. Next up, we've got Yellow Jacket. Yellow Jacket has fewer uses than the Wasp does, primarily because of this on-reveal effect. Afflict your other cards at this location with -1 power. You really don't want that popping out of Lockjaw in a Lockjaw deck. You really don't have a use for it in Patriot because it has an ability and therefore doesn't get the Patriot buff. This is a low tier card, a low priority card when it comes to making buying decisions. I would put this as a D or an F tier card, which means very low priority. Not one to spend tokens on. Next up we have Deadpool. Now, Deadpool is a fun card, and so if your goals in the game are simply to have fun, and you have no aspirations about acquiring Thanos, Galactus, Kang, Deadpool could be a consideration. It's not a card that I would recommend for serious players who are just entering Pool 3 or early in Pool 3. It's a card that you can build a deck around. You can stick it in Destruction deck and it'll be okay, but not great. It's a C tier card, fairly low priority when it comes to buying. The only reason I would recommend to buy this is if you are just playing for fun and the Deadpool deck appeals to you. It's a fun deck, it's not a particularly good deck. So, not a card for players who are trying to get as high as you can. This would be a card for more fun or casual players. Next up we have Human Torch, one of the first cards I pulled out of Pool 3. I like this card, it's a fun card. It's not especially good because the move deck is not especially good right now. As of March 6, 2023, the move deck is kind of a 4th tier deck. It's possible to get to infinite with it. You got to be like a movement specialist to do it, though. There likely will be more cards coming down the pipeline in the future that will make the movement deck better, and maybe it becomes viable at that point. Right now, Human Torch gets beat down from Killmonger, from Shang-Chi from time to time if he gets too big. I've seen him used in a bounce deck, which that was posted on Reddit that claims it got to infinite. Like I said, it's a fun card. I would definitely not put a priority on buying it early in Pool 3, though. Next up, we have Quinjet. Quinjet is featured prominently in the Thanos deck, so you're going to see it all the time on the ladder. And it's very good in the Thanos deck because it discounts the stones, because cards that don't start in your deck cost 1 less. And the stones don't count as having started in your deck, even though they are put into the deck immediately after the game starts. But they don't count as having started in your deck for the purposes of this card, and therefore the Quinjet discounts them. So you see this card constantly. It's decent in Dino as well, which adds cards to the deck with the use of the Sentinel, the White Queen, sometimes Cable, and Moon Girl. It's a very good card in that deck. It is not one that I would recommend buying, and the reason is this. The Dino deck is very good. It's strong. It can get you to infinite, and so if you entered into Pool 3 and just bought Quinjet and Arrow with tokens, you probably could get to infinite just with that. However, it would be a grind, and I've seen players that say they've gotten to infinite with the Dino. Arrow Dino is what I would call that deck that features Quinjet. I don't think you have to buy Quinjet, though, to play that deck. That's the reason that I'm not putting this as like a priority buy for new players. Priority buys are going to be reserved for cards where you only need to buy 1 or 2 cards, and then you can make a deck that's going to be capable of getting to infinite given enough time invested, or at least get you as high as possible on the ladder so that you can get those ranked rewards. Arrow is a card that I would recommend buying if that's one of your goals, to climb the ladder as high as possible. I don't think you have to have Quinjet to play the Dino Arrow deck, though. I think you can get by without it. It's going to be a good supporting card, but the Dino deck is... You're going to see lists that run Dino and only require a few Pool 3 cards in order to get you to infinite. And it's going to be tempting to buy those cards, because most of you who are just entering into Pool 3 probably played Dino at some point during Pool 2, because it's the strongest deck in Pool 2. And you figure, well, I already have experience with Dino, and I just need to buy 1 or 2 Pool 3 cards, and then I'm good to go. And that'll be tempting to do. My opinion of the Dino deck, though, is that it's overrated, and that getting to infinite with that deck is a lot harder than it looks at first glance. It requires a huge investment of time in order to get there. I would prefer for newer players, my recommendation, newer players to Pool 3 would be Spectrum Destroyer or Patriot Ultron. Those would be my recommendations for Pool 3 decks to shoot for. And so the Quinjet, not a card I would recommend buying, but it is higher up on the list. And if you are set on playing the Aero Dino deck in early Pool 3, Quinjet would be one of the cards that will make that deck better. So it's very borderline. It's right on the border between buy and don't buy, but my recommendation is don't buy. And only because I view the Aero Dino deck as kind of a tier 3 deck in early Pool 3. Tier 3 of the early Pool 3 decks. And of course, once you take into account all the cards that are available, it's not got any real place in the meta. However, if you want to play Aero Dino and then your aim is to eventually play Thanos, well then you can increase the priority on Quinjet, because it is very, very good in Thanos. So a borderline card, but not one that I am recommending that you buy in early Pool 3. Next up we have the Hood, a very solid card. It's a 1 cost -2, but it gives you a 1/6 token. A staple of the Deathwave deck, which is one of the decks you're going to want to go for pretty early in Pool 3. Right after the Spectrum Destroyer and the Patriot Ultron deck, Deathwave would be among the top decks I would recommend, and the only reason I wouldn't recommend it going for it over Spectrum Destroyer or over Patriot Ultron is that you can't afford to get all of the cards that you need with the tokens that you enter Pool 3 with. In order for a deck to be a deck that I recommend for early Pool 3 players, you have to be able to actually get it without pulling any cards from caches. And to play Deathwave, you need Wave, you need She-Hulk, you need Death, and then you also need Arrow. And that's one card too many to make Deathwave, and then possibly you need the Hood as well, though you can get away with just running Squirrel Girl instead of the Hood. So, if you have a mind to save up tokens and just kind of struggle in early Pool 3 to get anything done until you've got 4,000 tokens, and then you want to get Wave, Arrow, She-Hulk, and Death, and then play Deathwave, that would be a great way to go. You'll struggle at first, while you don't have any Pool 3 cards or just whatever you get from caches. But once you can play Deathwave, Deathwave consistently will get you to infinite if you put the time in and play it with skill. Now, it did get hit a little bit in the most recent patch because Sandman got a buff. So you see Electro Sandman on the ladder much more often now. And Sandman does hit Deathwave pretty hard. And also Leech is very, very popular right now. It's being run in the Lockjaw and the Thanos decks. And Leech is murder on Deathwave. And so getting to infinite with Deathwave is going to be a grind. However, Deathwave is very, very good against bots. And the longer I played this game, the more I realized that climbing the ladder efficiently isn't as much about making a deck that's really, really good against players as it is about making a deck that is capable of breaking even against players, or maybe grinding you out some cubes here and there, and then the deck beats bots like a drum. That will climb the ladder. That's what you really want. That's where your 8 cube victories are going to come from with Deathwave, because Deathwave puts a lot of power on the board at the end of the game with the Wave, She-Hulk, Death play. And the bots don't see it coming. They never see it coming, and so because they're not capable of seeing it coming. So they think that they're winning the game, and they snap, and then you pull your Wave, She-Hulk, Death play, and then you take them for 8 cubes. That play is so common, and has been so common for so long, that it's not going to work against players. If you even get it off, because you're going to get leeched a lot, and Sandman sometimes. The players are going to know it's coming. Everybody on the ladder will have seen it before. But the bots won't. And so your goal with the Deathwave to climb will simply be to break even, or maybe grind out a small cube profit against actual players, and then take the bots for all they're worth, and that can get you to infinite given enough time. So, if you are willing to struggle a little bit until you save up another 1,000 tokens from what you start with, Death Wave can be made with 4,000 tokens, and it's a very, very good option in early Pool 3. Hood would be the 5th card in that deck. So if you had 5,000 tokens, I mean, I don't know if I would really recommend spending 1,000 tokens on Hood. It's going to go in the fairly low priority buy for me. Death Wave is kind of a tier 3 deck. It's really been a tier 3 deck for a long time. And Hood is like the 5th best Pool 3 card in that tier 3 deck, so it's not a high priority buy. Next up, we've got Titania. Titania, most commonly seen in Shuri Zero, and it's a very good card in that deck. However, that deck requires a lot of Pool 3 cards and at least one Pool 4 card. That would be Shuri, and therefore this is not a high priority buy for newer players. It's going in the B tier. It is a pretty strong card in that deck, and it's also run in Zoo decks, and there's a Sandman deck that runs it as well. It really needs a 0 to reach its full potential because that ability can be a bit unpredictable to use. The card also has a place in the Have Some Junk style deck, though that is not a very strong deck in the meta in my opinion. So you most commonly see this card run with 0, and really needs 0 to reach its fullest potential. So not a high priority buy for newer players unless you're dead set on just going straight for the Shuri Zero deck, which is top tier at the moment, and I don't believe that Shuri is on the nerf radar, but don't quote me on that. But the Shuri Zero deck is a known entity right now. Every player who's making a deck on the ladder thinks about, how am I going to counter Shuri Zero? So its effectiveness has waned a bit and will continue to as players become more and more familiar with what it can do, and as more and more players save up their tokens and buy Shuri because of how strong the deck is right now. Lots of players are going to make that a goal, and so you're going to see more and more mirror matches playing Shuri Zero, which will further erode its win rate and its cube rate. But Titania is decent in a few other decks, so I think it belongs in the B tier, but not a recommended buy for newer players. And last of the 1-cost cards is Zero, a very OP card at the moment. It is a staple in any deck that features Red Skull. It's a staple in the Shuri Zero deck. It's a card that really shouldn't have 3 power in my opinion because its ability is so strong. It should really probably have 2 power, or even 1 power, or possibly even 0 power, and it would still get played. But it has 3 power. It's a very, very strong card, but not one that I would recommend for new players because you have to buy so many Pool 3 cards to make the decks that feature 0 work that it's really out of reach of early Pool 3 players. But it's a card you're going to want at some point in its current state. You're absolutely going to want this card as soon as you can. I'm sad that I haven't pulled it myself yet. It handicaps me in terms of my deck design, but it is a very, very strong S tier card at the moment, unless it gets nerfed, and it might. I haven't seen any signs that that's going to happen, but I do think the card is OP, and so it's possible it gets nerfed in the future. Now we're into the 2-cost cards, and first up is going to be Adam Warlock. This is going very low on the what order should I buy these cards list. It really only sees play in Mr. Negative. I've seen players try to make use of it in other decks. I don't even really think it's good in Mr. Negative. There really are no circumstances at this moment in time where I would recommend an early Pool 3 player buy Adam Warlock. He is just difficult to use well. Not a good card. Even in his best case use scenario, which is Mr. Negative, he's not good. Definitely not needed for that deck at all. He's a card that you kind of like try to fit into a deck just because you pulled him from a cache and you want to see if you can get any use out of him. I tried, I couldn't. Don't recommend anybody buy him. Next up we have Baron Mordo, another card similar to Adam Warlock. On reveal, your opponent draws a card, set its cost to 6. That seems like it might be good because you think to yourself, well, maybe I can set my opponent's important combo piece to 6, and then he won't be able to play his combo. In practice, it often doesn't seem to work the way you think or the way you hope that it will. Sometimes it draws them a 6 cost card, and then you just played a card that benefited your opponent. I see players sometimes play this with Ronan the Accuser, who gains power based on the number of cards in your opponent's hand. That's a fun deck in my estimation right now. So really there are no circumstances where I would recommend someone buy Baron Mordo with their tokens in early pool 2 or in early pool 3. I mean, he's not a strong card. When you look at his power, he's 3 power for 2 cost. For this card to be good, he would need to be, like, in order to be good enough to buy, he'd really need 2 or 3 more power than he has. So you have to ask, is his ability worth 3 power? Well, I would value your opponent drawing a card at negative 3 power. Your opponent drawing a card is generally good for your opponent. So I would actually say this card is 2 cost, 0 power. And so what you need to get out of that cost increase on the card is the equivalent of 5 or 6 power. You need the card that your opponent draws to increase in cost by 3 to 6, depending on what the card is. And that just isn't going to happen reliably. So that's why Baron Mordo isn't good. Next up we have Beast. 2 cost, 2 power. Return your other cards at this location to your hand. They cost 1 less. I have seen bounce decks. I've seen at least one bounce deck that at least claims to have gotten to infinite on Reddit. Bounce is a fun deck right now. It's not good. In fact, Beast may even be like a C plus D minus card, or a C minus D plus card. Not a high priority buy. And as of right now, the bounce deck is a fun deck, but it's not got a very, it's not very high up the meta list right now. So, wouldn't recommend anybody buy this. He is fun though. If you pull him from a cache, he's fun to mess around with after you've gotten to infinite, because you're gonna, in my estimation, struggle to gain ranks with a deck based around Beast. I've seen players try to use him in move decks, as well as just bounce decks, usually things like Iron Fist, Human Torch, or things like that. It's hard to make it work though, and so it's not very strong. And therefore I wouldn't recommend spending tokens on him. Next up we have Black Widow, a card that was in the meta for a little while as part of the Dino Hawk deck. It's fallen out of favor since the nerf of Zabu and then the nerf to Darkhawk, so you rarely see it now. Except in the Have Some Junk style deck, which in my opinion is a fun deck but not a particularly strong one. So Black Widow, not a high priority buy. Clogging up your opponent's board is fun, entertaining. But if your goal is to get as high on the ladder as you can and you're just entering into pool 3, this would not be a good place to spend the tokens, because the deck it features in isn't particularly strong at the moment. So this would be a deck really only if you really want to play the Have Some Junk style deck just for fun. Then this might be a buy in that situation, but otherwise stay away from it. Next up we have Colleen Wing, a very strong card in a discard deck. It's really a staple of that deck because it typically will allow you to discard the card Swarm, which will then generate. Swarm is a 2 cost, 3 power card, and when discarded it will duplicate in your hand and then cost 0, so you get 2 zero cost 3 power cards when Colleen Wing targets Swarm. So you see her in Dracula Apocalypse decks with MODOK. You see her sometimes in Hela decks. You see her in her own Tempo deck that's just trying to use her with the Swarm to generate a strong tempo play and then usually use Arrow at the end of the game. This is a good card, but not a card that I would recommend buying unless you're really aiming to play a Dracula MODOK style deck. And that deck was very, very strong early in this season. It seemed like players were getting to Infinite with it relatively regularly. I almost never see it now, though, because Leech is so prevalent, and Leech really gives discard problems. So discard isn't a deck that I really recommend aiming for, even if you're aiming for an advanced deck, unless you just really find the idea of the deck appealing and fun. In that case, I could recommend buying a card like Colleen Wing, but you're going to need to buy a lot of cards to make that deck work. It's not a simple one. The Hela Casino style deck is a lot of fun to play, but it requires a lot of Pool 3 cards to be good, and therefore I don't recommend it for early Pool 3 players. And it is okay once you've acquired all the cards you need for it. It's okay. It's fun. It's kind of a C or even a D tier deck, but you can get to Infinite if you put in enough time. At this moment, I should probably go over what your expectations should be for getting to Infinite, because you'll see a lot of videos on YouTube saying this deck will get you to Infinite, that deck will get you to Infinite, this deck is overpowered, etc., etc. The recommendations that I'm giving, if you follow them in early Pool 3, you can get to Infinite if you're willing to put in a lot of time. And my estimation is, if you were to buy the cards for Spectrum Destroyer or Patriot Ultron, you can get to Infinite if you're willing to put in, my estimate would be 100 to 120 or 130 hours for the month of gameplay. With the Spectrum Destroyer or the Patriot Ultron will at least give you a good chance of getting to Infinite. I'm not even guaranteeing it. It will be dependent on your skill level, what the changes in the meta are, because in just a few hours we're going to see the release of a new season and Nimrod. I don't anticipate Nimrod changing the meta too much. So I would say if you want to reach Infinite in your first season in Pool 3, plan on 100 to 130 hours of gameplay, even if you spend your tokens wisely and get a deck that's capable of doing it. Now, if you watch my gameplay videos and you think to yourself, this guy makes a lot of mistakes, I can probably play better than he does, well, then you can subtract some amount of hours from the 100 to 130 hours. You could maybe drop that down to, 90 or 80 if you figure you can play a lot better than I do. And if you watch my gameplay videos and you figure, I really don't have the experience with card games that guy has, because I do have a lot of experience with card games playing Hearthstone and Star Wars CCG, and then a lot of poker in college, a lot of poker at a near professional level, but not quite professional. And maybe you don't have that kind of experience with card games, and you figure, okay, so maybe it would take me more than 100 to 130 hours to reach Infinite. So, make your plans accordingly, and don't assume that following the advice in this video will automatically get you to Infinite. It won't. I promise you it won't. And I promise you that there is no video on YouTube where you can just follow the advice and you will have a cakewalk up to Infinite. This is a very, very grindy game if you want to get to Infinite. It's designed that way, in my opinion. And so you should expect 100 hours, even with a really, really strong deck. Expect 100 hours. The players that you see getting to Infinite in one day, the way that they've done it is that they have either spent a lot of money or been playing long enough to have acquired some very powerful cards. They can make the absolute best decks possible, and then they did that, and then they played a lot. And the way that the matchmaking works is once they got to Infinite and they kept going, Their MMR, which is the matchmaker rating, kept climbing and climbing and climbing until there were no appropriate matches for them because their MMR was so much higher than the other players, and then all the game does is match them against bots. And then as they kept playing bots, they kept beating the bots because the bots are easy to beat, and they kept climbing and climbing and climbing. And so their matchmaker rating is so high that when the season resets, they still just play against bots at rank 70 all the way up to 100, and that's how they get from 70 to 100 in one day. But under no circumstances should you, a player entering into Pool 3, assume that you can do that, because you won't be facing the same opponents that they face. They face bots because they got their MMR so high that the game can't find any appropriate matches for them. And by the way, that is in no way intended to knock those players. It's not easy to get your MMR that high. Even if you spend a lot of money on the game, even if you've been playing it for 6 months because you were in the beta, there's very few players that have managed to get their MMR that high. And I have nothing negative to say about that. They're amazing players, and often they design really interesting decks, and I enjoy watching them. The only reason I'm bringing it up in this video is to warn you, the viewer, not to think, oh, I'll just buy the exact same deck that I see them playing, and then I will be able to do the same thing they do. You won't. Not at first, anyway. It's possible you will be able to over time. If you can get to infinite and then push your MMR so high that the game can't find any matches for you, then you can do the same thing. But otherwise, you're going to build the same deck that they build and have a very different experience with it than they do, because they're playing against bots and you are not. So, moving on. Next up we have Dagger. This is another movement deck card. It's recently gotten a buff. It's still F tier. Do not buy. It was 2 cost 1 power. It's now 2 cost 2 power. That doesn't do it. Even in the movement deck, this is the least of the Pool 3 cards that get into that deck. I'm not even sure it's worth a slot in that deck. And that deck isn't that strong, so this is a very low priority card. We go from that to Daredevil, which is a phenomenal card, an S tier card. Gets played in control decks primarily, and in that deck it is an essential card, perhaps the most essential card. And if you follow my recommendation and play either Spectrum Destroyer, Patriot Ultron, or perhaps Deathwave, if you choose the Spectrum Destroyer deck, I would recommend buying Destroyer and Daredevil. And that will give you a very good chance to get some of those rewards for climbing the rank ladder. That's as good as it gets, really, in early Pool 3, is either Spectrum Destroyer, Deathwave, or Patriot Ultron, depending on how patient you're willing to be. And you don't have to have Daredevil to play Spectrum Destroyer, but it is my opinion that it makes the deck a lot better. And then Daredevil will also be featured in control decks from here until the end of time, because that ability is so strong. On turn 5, you get to see your opponent's plays before you make your own. Saves you cubes. I'll be very happy when I pull this card myself. Been tempted to spend tokens on it myself. Haven't, because I'm saving up for Kang, but if you're entering into Pool 3 and you want to make a strong deck now, buying Destroyer and then possibly Daredevil will help you a lot. Now, you don't have to buy Daredevil, but it does make that deck a lot better in my opinion. This is a very, very strong card. One of the best in the game. Last up for the 2-cost cards is Falcon. This is a bad card. It does get played in the bounce deck, but again, the bounce deck is just a fun deck. Falcon returns your 1-cost cards to your hand. In order for this to be a card that I'd recommend buying, it would need an additional 2 or possibly 3 power at least. That ability, returning your 1-cost cards to your hand, would only generate you an additional 3 power if you could get an extra 3 power out of your 1-cost cards that get returned to your hand, but that's very unlikely because it doesn't discount those cards at all. You still have to pay for them all over again. So Falcon doesn't really generate value with its ability, except in limited circumstances. So even in its best case scenario, it's just not that strong. And under no circumstances would I recommend buying it. Moving into the 3-cost cards now. First up we have Agent Coulson, who was recently moved from Pool 4 down into Pool 3. I wouldn't recommend buying him. He has a use in the Dino deck, as he adds 2 cards to your hand. They are random, so whether you'll get any use out of the cards added to your hand, sometimes you will, sometimes you won't. But he can add power to the Dino in situations where you really need the 2 cards because your hand isn't full and the Dino's on the table. That's kind of a niche case use. He's not bad in the Dino deck, but not a card that I'd recommend buying, and he doesn't really have a use outside of that deck. So he's like a 3rd or 4th best Pool 3 card in the Dino Arrow deck, and doesn't have any uses outside of it, so not a high priority buy. Next up we have Black Cat, a recently buffed card. Used to be a 3/6, now is a 3/7. If this is in your hand at the end of your turn, discard it. It has kind of a limited use in Hela. It's very rare that I've seen anybody actually play this card from their hand. So really it gets played with Hela. It could buff MODOK, or not MODOK, but it can buff Morbius a little bit. I wouldn't put a priority on buying this card. It probably belongs in the D tier, to be honest, because it's such a low priority buy. I think it can add a little bit to the Hela deck. A little bit, but I'd put it last on the list of cards that you would typically put in a Hela deck in terms of the order that you'll want to buy them. Because you can easily play a strong Hela deck without Black Cat. If you have it though, yeah, I'd throw it in the deck and see how it does. But definitely not one I'd recommend buying. Next up we've got Brood. Brood used to be a very strong A or even S tier card when the Silver Surfer meta was upon us. It's fallen out of favor since then. It still sees play in the Silver Surfer deck from time to time, and it sees play in the Patriot Ultron deck, or just Patriot decks in general, because the Broodling that spawns doesn't have any ability, so it gets the Patriot buff. It's a B tier card. It's good in those decks. It's not necessary, but it's good. It's one of the cards I purchased with tokens, but I was operating under the Silver Surfer meta at the time, and this card was in my opinion, an S or A plus tier card in the Silver Surfer meta. Now it's fallen down. Even if you're going to play Patriot Ultron, I would buy Patriot, Mystique, and Ultron. And so this card would be like the 4th best card in that deck, and not even really necessary to play the deck. So it's a fairly low priority. It's probably like a B- card now. Now that the Silver Surfer deck is fallen down the meta so much that I wouldn't really recommend buying the cards for it. Next up we have Debris. Debris can be decent in the have some junk style deck. It also has a use in the Patriot deck, but it's like similar to Brood. It's like the 4th or 5th best card. In fact, I'd probably put it 5th best behind Brood, behind Patriot, Ultron, Mystique, and Brood. So it'd be like 5th best card in the Patriot deck. And the have some junk style deck is a fun deck, but not a particularly good one. So I wouldn't put a high priority on buying Debris. Next up we have Electro, a solid A tier card. It's an essential part of the Electro Wave ramp deck. And that deck, ramp decks in other card games I would say are probably a little stronger in general than ramp decks in Marvel Snap. The ramp deck I would rank definitely behind Thanos, behind Shuri Zero for sure, behind Deathwave. So it's like a second rate or even a third rate deck in my opinion. But it is better than a lot of other options. It's It's a competitive deck. I wouldn't rank it as a fun deck. It's strong. It wouldn't be the highest priority that for players who are entering into Pool 3, I wouldn't say to them you should go straight for the Electro Ramp deck because it's so good right now. It's okay. I've seen players posting that they got to Infinite with it for sure. There's different variations of it running cards like Doctor Doom, Odin. I've also seen variations that go bigger, taller, with cards that are just not necessarily projecting power across lanes, but are just strong in their lane. So there's different options with it, and Electro is also prominently featured in the Galactus deck, which is certainly not a deck that I would recommend for early Pool 3 players or really anybody, because I view that kind of as a grindy and sure to get boring fairly quickly style of play. But Electro is a strong card, and the Electro Ramp deck is strong. It's not top tier, but it's pretty strong. Next up we have Cerebro. Cerebro is, well, for a time, Cerebro 2's decks often got posted as having got their makers to Infinite. I tried Cerebro 2. I don't think it's particularly strong. I think it gets hit hard by Leech. It gets hit by Sandman. The biggest problem with it, though, is that it gets hit by a variety of different locations. There's a variety of different locations that can disrupt the Cerebro 2 deck, and so playing it just turns into a grind of hardly ever getting your deck to work exactly the way you hope it will, or that it's designed to work. Cerebro needs more tools. I think it needs one or two more tools to combat the different locations that really hurt it in order to elevate it, and it probably needs Leech to fall out of the meta as well. So I don't recommend buying the Cerebro 2 deck, even though it's tempting because you really only need Cerebro and Mystique to make it work, and so it can look appealing to players that are early in Pool 3, but I don't think it's very strong because there's so many locations that disrupt it, and because of the prevalence of Leech right now. Next up we have Gambit. Gambit is a lot of fun. It's got a strong place in the Hella Discard deck. And there's some niche decks where you run like Wong, Mystique, and then Gambit to destroy a portion of the opponent's board. I tried that in Mr. Negative a little bit, and it's a lot of fun. It's very funny when it works, but it doesn't work very consistently. And the problem with this is that it destroys a random enemy card, and armor is very, very common right now. And so often, Gambit will still try to target cards that are protected by armor. If he would only target cards that he actually can destroy, he'd be a lot better and would be seen a lot more frequently. But he doesn't. He'll still try to target cards that are protected by armor or that are protected by the location Wakanda. And then his playing card just bounces off them and they aren't destroyed. So, not a high priority buy, but he's a lot of fun if you do pull him and you pull other cards to make the Hella deck work, or possibly a Wong Mystique deck. Just don't expect to climb too much with it. You can climb with Hella, though, if you have all the cards for it. Not easy to get, though. Next up, we have Green Goblin, often seen in some Have Some Junk style decks, and from time to time with certain featured or hot locations on the ladder. For example, the Space Throne, where you can only play one card. Everybody was running Green Goblin when that was the hot location, and they were playing this on turn 3 at the Space Throne. Apart from that, though, this isn't a particularly strong card. The decks that it goes in are not particularly strong. In those decks, it's a decent card, but it's just that those decks aren't very strong right now. So there is a Cerebro 2's deck that would run Green Goblin and Hobgoblin. I think that's probably the best version of the Cerebro's 2's deck, but even with those cards, I don't think Cerebro 2's is very good, so I wouldn't put a priority on buying Green Goblin unless you're just playing for fun, and it is a fun or a funny card to play if you like the Have Some Junk style of gameplay. But apart from that, I wouldn't recommend this. Next up we have Kingpin. I've seen plenty of attempts to make Kingpin work, haven't seen any succeed. When a card moves here on turn 6, destroy it. During beta, it didn't have the requirement of being on turn 6. You could have cards move there any turn, and then it really was good. But it got nerfed to just turn 6, and so now it's hard to make it work. Hard to make it work well. You could theoretically run like Sarah and then play Arrow Kingpin on turn 6. But it wouldn't destroy any cards that get played to that lane. The lane you played it, only cards that get played to other lanes. So it wouldn't always be good. It would sometimes, but I don't think this card is good. I'm not recommending anybody buy it. You'll see some videos on YouTube of players playing it for fun, really, because I haven't seen anybody make a really strong deck with this card. So definitely not a recommended. Not recommending anyone buy this in early pool 3. Or really at any time. Next up we have Lockjaw. Lockjaw is a very, very good card. Features prominently in the meta right now in Thanos and in its own Lockjaw deck, either the variant that I played to Infinite this season with Dracula, or the variant that uses Thor and Mighty Thor. It's probably the second best card in the Thanos deck. This is a very, very strong deck. However, to play the Lockjaw Thor Mighty Thor deck, or to play the variant that I'm running, the Lockjaw Dracula, which features Giganto as well, it requires a lot of Pool 3 cards, and so it's not a deck that I would recommend that early Pool 3 players go for, because my goal with this guide is to get you on your feet as fast as possible in early Pool 3. And if you go for a Lockjaw deck, you're going to be waiting a while you save up the tokens to buy all the cards. And so this isn't on my recommended buy list for early Pool 3 players, but it is an S tier card. The second best card in the Thanos deck, behind Thanos, which is necessary to run the Thanos deck, and it's probably the best card in the Lockjaw Dracula deck that I ran this season, or the Lockjaw Thor Mighty Thor deck. So top tier card, just not a recommended buy, because the decks that run it, you need to have a lot of Pool 3 cards, and that's out of reach for early Pool 3 players. And I want to get you on your feet as fast as possible in early Pool 3. Next up we have Maximus. This card is seen in a few different decks. It's a very solid card. It was most commonly seen in Silver Surfer, which has fallen out of the meta, but it still gets played in like the Sauron Shuri deck. It gets played in decks that run Zero. It's a very, very strong tempo card, especially if you can play around the on reveal at all, and sometimes you can. There are a few different ways. You can hide it behind Invisible Woman, you can silence it, you can play it when your opponent's hand is already full, you can take advantage of locations sometimes so that the effect doesn't go off because the location blocks the on reveal or something like that, or you can play it behind Cosmo to block the on reveal. It's a very strong tempo card, and I'd put it higher up the B tier, but not a particularly high priority buy, because in the decks that run it, it's usually like the third best card or something like that. And the decks that run it are quite good, but they're also going to be out of reach for early Pool 3 players. Next up we have Moon Knight, a very strong disruption card in the Hela deck, but not a high priority buy. It is necessary to play a good Hela deck in my opinion, though I have seen ones that claim to have gotten to Infinite without running Moon Knight. But it really is disruptive to opponents. It'll win you games from time to time. Not 8 cube games, because the opponent will usually just retreat if they lose their essential card, but it does win you some games. And the Hela deck is a lot of fun to play. It's not incredibly strong. So Moon Knight isn't a card that I would recommend buying, but it is a lot of fun to play. And it is maybe the strongest discard card, meaning cards that actually discard cards from your hand. And Stature is out now, a pool 5 card that can be played for 1 cost, a 7 power card if the opponent has discarded a card. I've seen some decks trying to run Stature that use Moon Knight. It's a good card in the Hella discard deck primarily, but not an important one to buy. Next up we have Mystique, a very strong card in a variety of different decks. A staple of Patriot Ultron, one of my top 3 recommended decks for early Pool 3 players. It also gets played in Dino Hawk. It gets played in Cerebro for sure. So it's a very strong card. Duplicating cards are always going to have their uses. Pretty much always. I think as long as the game lasts, any card that duplicates is going to have a place in some meta deck. Those would be cards like Shuri, which doubles the power of a card, Mystique, which copies an ongoing ability, Absorbing Man, which copies a non-reveal, Moon Girl that copies your hand. Anything like that that allows you to play the same card twice, I think, is always going to have a place in the meta. And so Mystique is a very strong card and could potentially be a recommended buy if you decide that you're going to aim for the Patriot Ultron deck as you enter Pool 3. One of my top 3 recommended decks, and Mystique is one of the cards I would recommend buying for that deck, the other 2 being Ultron and Patriot. Speaking of Patriot, he's next up. He's a very strong A-tier card. Your cards with no abilities have +2 power. That makes him relatively easy to play. His deck is relatively easy to play. It does not have a very high skill ceiling, and therefore is a very good deck to play as you're learning the game. It'll get you some of those ranked rewards, possibly all of them if you're willing to put in the time, and also you have the skill. Not a guarantee, but I do see players every season making it to Infinite with Patriot Ultron. It will be a grind though, because 120 hours of Patriot being a relatively simple deck to play, I'd probably recommend the Spectrum Destroyer with Daredevil or the Deathwave more than Patriot Ultron, especially if you're willing to wait a little bit so you can get all 4 of the cards you need to play Deathwave. But if you're very new to card games, Patriot Ultron is a very good deck to play, and it's strong. It'll get you some of the ranked rewards, and you'll learn the game better. And so definitely a recommended deck for newer players. And if you're going to play the Patriot Ultron deck, you're going to want to buy Ultron, Patriot, and Mystique with your 3,000 tokens that you get when you enter into Pool 3. I think Patriot's always going to have a place in the meta. That ability is just very strong. Next up we have Polaris. It's a disruption style card that moves an opposing 1 or 2 cost cards to this location when it's played. It's a B tier card. It goes kind of higher up the B tier. The disruption that it provides can be good with certain locations and certain situations where you force your opponent to fill up a location early, or pull a card over to Space Throne that's small or something like that. It doesn't get played a lot anymore. It was a staple of the Silver Surfer deck. Doesn't get played a lot anymore. Wouldn't be a high priority buy, but it's fairly strong in the decks that do run it. If the deck style is kind of a more disruption style deck, it's a pretty good card in that deck, but still not a high priority buy, as the decks that do run it are not very high up the tier list at the moment. Next up we have Rogue. Steal an ongoing ability from a random enemy card at this location. Fantastic when it happens. It doesn't happen that much. Ongoing cards aren't really in the meta that much at the moment. Rogue gets played a lot in Mr. Negative type decks, and it's probably the 3rd or 4th best card in that deck, so a pretty low priority buy. There may be, in fact there probably will be metas in the future in which there's some really powerful ongoing ability, and Rogue will be an important counter then. But at the moment, ongoing cards aren't that big. There's a few ongoing effects in Thanos decks, but they're not so strong that they're worth playing Rogue over just to counter them. They're not worth playing Rogue just to counter those ongoing effects. They're things like Soulstone or Blue Marvel or things like that. And they're nice effects. They're just not so powerful that it makes Rogue worth running just to counter them. So at the moment, Rogue's a pretty low priority card. But she is pretty good in Mr. Negative. Next up we have Thor. Thor would be at the top of the B tier, maybe the bottom of the A tier. He's very good. He is very important for the Lockjaw Thor, Mighty Thor deck. In fact, you really can't play that deck without him. But of course, you can play Lockjaw Dracula, like the one that I got to Infinite with this season, just fine without Thor. He got played a lot in Silver Surfer decks as well, which fell out of the meta. He's probably like the top of the B tier. There's always going to be a place for him in just good cards decks because he can get you to 10 power for 3 costs. Now, you do have to draw Mjolnir, and if you don't have anything to help you get Mjolnir out of the deck, that's probably only like 50% chance, and then when you draw Mjolnir, that means you're not drawing another card from the deck, and that does have negative value. So he's not, even in his best case use, if you're not running Jane Foster, he's not just like a 3-10 or a 3-7 if you account for only 50% of the time you're drawing Mjolnir. I would value this card if you just put him in your deck without Jane Foster. I'd value him at like a 3-5, maybe a 3-5.5. That's where I'd put him. So he's very, very strong in Mighty Thor. Outside Mighty Thor, he's still pretty good in just a good cards deck. Seeing good cards decks that run him. I would probably run him myself in that deck. But not a high priority buy. But he's very good. I'd be happy to pull him out of a cache. Next up we have Juggernaut, a very strong disruption style card that got played a lot, again in the Silver Surfer deck. Not as much anymore, though I think it does still have a place in lane control decks combined with Storm, and he's very good in that role. A strong B tier card, not a priority buy. The control style play isn't for everybody, and for those of you who do really like it, you have to get a lot of cards to make it work. You have to acquire a lot of Pool 3 cards to make it work, and so it's not one that I recommend new players go for, but this is a strong card, a very strong lane disruption card. I like him a lot, and I will probably play the Daredevil lane control style deck as soon as I get the cards for it. Juggernaut is one of the cards I need, along with Daredevil. Once I get those two, I can play it. But I like that style of play. I think it's good, and Juggernaut is a very good card in that deck. Next up we have Venom, a card I expect to see a lot more after the introduction of Nimrod, who's coming in about an hour. Venom destroys your other cards with the location, add their power to this card. I've also seen him played in a Venom Arnim Zola deck, which tries to make a big Venom and then copy it to the other lanes with Arnim Zola. Not very common. You don't see it often. Null was recently moved from Series 5 to Series 4, and Venom would be decent with Null as well. I still haven't seen a good list that features Venom or Null, though, so at the moment he's not a high priority card, but I'm leaving open the possibility that there will be decks that make very good use of Venom after Nimrod is added. I don't think he'll be top tier, though. I don't think Nimrod will be a top tier deck. I don't think it's going to challenge Thanos or Shuri Zero in the meta. It's possible I'm wrong about that. Don't quote me on that. I will buy the Battle Pass myself and see what there is to see with Nimrod. But I'm anticipating something similar to MODOK, where people will get to Infinite with him early, then he'll kind of fall out of the meta. And Venom isn't commonly played in really any meta deck at the moment. The Venom Arnim Zola deck I think looks fun, and I'll probably try it, but I don't expect it to be very strong or to be high up in the meta list. To be something to play for fun at the moment. But Venom has potential to be featured in combos with cards that have yet to be released. We'll see. At the moment, not a high priority buy. The last of the 3-cost cards is Wave. The card I'm very sad I haven't pulled yet. It is a S tier card, a staple of Electro Ramp and Death Wave. Probably the most important card in Death Wave, and a very strong card in Electro Ramp. This is an S tier card. It provides large cost reduction. Allows you to play a 6-cost card on turn 4. Because of that, it's always going to be in some meta deck. Any card that provides cost reduction of at least 2 is always going to have a place in the meta. Cards like Sarah, Wave, Electro, they're always going to have some kind of place in the meta. Electro provides 1 cost, 1 extra energy per turn though. So over the course of the game if you play it on turn 3, you get at least 2 energy. Any card that provides you with at least 2 energy over the course of the game extra is going to have a place in the meta, and Wave always will. And if you are just entering Pool 3 and you have a mind to wait until you have 4,000 tokens, Death Wave is a very, very good option for you to get as high as you can on the ladder and get some of those ranked rewards. And possibly to infinite if you have 100 to 130 hours to play. And some degree of skill at card games. Moving on to the 4-cost cards. First up is Absorbing Man. Absorbing Man is a doubling effect, and he's always going to have some potential. I don't know any decks that he really features prominently in right now. Rank him as like a middle-of-the-road B tier card because of his potential, not because of how he's being used at the moment, but doubling effects, they're always going to have potential to create some new, very strong deck. And so, Absorbing Man, I don't really recommend buying him, but he is a card that I think is strong and has got potential. He was featured prominently in the Zabu meta, along with Spider-Man, which was very unfun to play against. There will be combos in the future featuring him, which are either strong, some combination of strong and not fun to play against. As of right now, he's not featured too much, so he's not a recommended buy, but I do think he's underrated, underplayed, and a generally strong card, but perhaps not particularly strong in this meta. Next up we have Crossbones, a card I do think is a little bit underrated, but still not one I recommend buying. If deck features Crossbones, you can most of the time just play Jessica Jones and she'll do exactly the same thing. I did play Crossbones in the deck I used to get to Infinite last season, but that was in the Zabu meta. Crossbones isn't a card that I'd recommend that anybody buy. The restriction that you can only play this at locations where you're winning makes him just pretty much worse than Jessica Jones in most cases. Though I guess there are some where, like turn 6, which is why he got played in that Zabu deck, because you could play 3 4-cost cards on turn 6, and in that case, Crossbones was probably better than Jessica Jones. But apart from that, she's generally better, and she's free. So I wouldn't buy Crossbones. Next up we have Crystal. I tried to make Crystal work a little bit in this Mr. Negative. It worked okay. It's not a good card. I would not buy this card. It's possible in the future, at some point, there's some deck that makes good use of her. But as of right now, I wouldn't even really play her in a fun deck, I don't think. She is just not good. There's not that many situations where you want to get rid of your hand and draw 3 cards, because usually that means downsizing your hand, which is almost something you almost never want to do in a card game. So if she was maybe like 4-5 or 4-6, okay, that's a conversation. But at 4-4, no, she's no good. Next up, we have Dracula. Dracula, very strong S tier card. One of the best cards for climbing the ladder because, at least my suspicion is, the bots read this as a 0 power card. And so they're likely to snap against it. And then he pulls a card. He discards a card from your hand at the end of the game. Gains power that the bots didn't expect. Helps you farm cubes. He's a hard card for players to read too, since they have no way of knowing what's in your hand. Most of the time. This is a very, very strong card. I wouldn't recommend buying it only because the decks that run him, you have to buy a lot of cards to make them work. More cards than you're going to have tokens for in early Pool 3. But he is an S tier card, and he will always have a place in the meta. At least in his current form. And I have no reason to think he's going to change. So, one of the strongest cards in the game. Next up we have Drax. Drax was changed relatively recently. He used to be a 4-cost 4 power that provided +4 to his power on reveal if the opponent played a card here. Now he's been changed a little bit to make him a little bit more consistent. He's still not good. I don't recommend buying him unless you have your heart set on playing a Guardians of the Galaxy themed deck, which would just be a fun deck. It won't get you anywhere. He's probably F tier now that Zabu's out of the meta, to be honest. He saw some play when Zabu was good, but now, don't buy him. Going from that to Ghost Rider, one of the strongest cards in the game. Bring back one of your discarded cards to this location. He's featured in decks with Infinite and Lady Sif to discard the Infinite and then bring him back with Ghost Rider. Featured in an Agatha Harkness deck that, while certainly not top tier, is decent. He's always going to have a place in the meta because he provides the potential for quite a lot of cost reduction. You can play Lady Sif on 3 and Ghost Rider on 4, and you'll have 27 power on the table for your 7 energy. If you had Infinite in your hand to discard. Very strong card. Very strong in Hela. Probably the second best card in that deck. And very strong in the Dracula Lady Sif Infinite deck. Sometimes that deck runs Giganto as well. Very, very good card. Not quite as good as Dracula, I don't think. Probably like an S- or an A+ tier card, but I'm putting him in the S tier. I think he's always going to be very strong. Next we have Hellcow. Pretty weak. Kind of obsolete now that MODOK is in the meta. Used to see play sometimes in Hela decks. Really never now. I'd rank him as D, maybe even F on the priority list. I guess D because he'd still be okay in C play sometimes if it wasn't for MODOK. And MODOK will be going into Series 5 now. And won't be easy to acquire for a lot of players, so Hellcow doesn't get the F tier, but he's not very strong. Even in the Hela deck, he's usually like the first card to get the axe if you want to put in something else. I don't think I would run him in my ideal Hela deck, so I wouldn't recommend buying this. Next up we have Miles Morales. Movement just isn't that good right now. And Miles is okay in the movement deck. I would include him in a movement deck. It's just movement deck's not that great. So he's kind of similar to Human Torch. I like Human Torch better, just personal preference. I like playing the card. Miles Morales has a lower ceiling than Human Torch, but he's more reliable. But movement just isn't in that good a place. If it goes up the meta, then Miles Morales could potentially move up a tier or two. I find it hard to imagine a scenario where I'd ever put him as a high priority buy, but He may move up a little if movement does. As of right now, he's C tier. Next up we have Mr. Negative, a solid A tier card, but the deck isn't very good right now, and the reason is because Leech absolutely destroys it, and Leech is very popular. The developers seem to be very clear about their intention to not have combo decks be very strong. So we have Leech and Sandman in the meta, and they're making it very, very difficult to get anywhere with a combo deck. So I like Mr. Negative a lot, but he's not very good at the moment because Leech just annihilates him. He'll get you some 8 cube wins against bots, but it's tough to even break even against other players at the moment. Though, if you have Bast from Series 4, then I think Mr. Negative is certainly playable. But without a Series 4 card, he's struggling, and even with it, he's struggling against Leech, and so I can't recommend it that anybody buy Mr. Negative with tokens at the moment. Next up we have Omega Red. I like this card a little bit. If you're ahead by 10 power here, plus 4 power to other locations. I enjoyed playing him in a Zabu combo deck, but without Zabu, he's fallen out of the meta completely. I do think he has potential to come back into it at some point, but right now he's a C tier card and a low priority buy. There aren't any strong decks that run him that I'm aware of. But I think he's got potential for the future. But right now, no reason to spend tokens on this. Next up we have Rescue. Rescue gets played in Miracle Sarah type decks. It's not a necessary card in that deck though. There are other cards that work in that slot just fine, which makes this a relatively low priority buy. It's just kind of a generic good card and can be substituted for any other generic good card. It's slightly better than Jessica Jones, but requires more work to make it work, and it is vulnerable to Shang-Chi. So I'm not even sure that it's better than Jessica Jones. A low priority buy. Next up we have Rock Slide, a card that was featured a lot in the Zabu meta, as most of the 4-cost cards were. It has now fallen out, and the Darkhawk was just recently nerfed. The Darkhawk, which means the Darkhawk deck was nerfed even further after Zabu was nerfed. And so Rock Slide is a C tier card, and it may come back into the meta. It's always going to have a place with Darkhawk. So it may deserve to be a little bit higher up the C tier than, say, Omega Red or Rescue, but still a C tier card, a low priority card, unless you really want to play the Darkhawk deck, which isn't particularly strong in my opinion at the moment. Though there may be a Darkhawk list that's decent, and probably from time to time we'll see posts with players getting to Infinite using the Darkhawk deck. But it's not particularly strong or high up the meta at the moment. Next up we have Spider-Man, a solid B tier card. He was terrorizing the meta, combined with Absorbing Man when Zabu was powerful. He's still a decent card in the control deck. He gets played in Galactus decks. He's a good control card, but not a high priority buy, because the control deck, it's kind of niche in its appeal and requires a lot of pool 3 cards. But I will play that control deck once I get Daredevil and Juggernaut, and Spider-Man will be in it. And he's probably going to have a place in the meta for some time to come, because his effect is strong. He's just not so powerful that I would say you must have this card right now. Or, you can wait until you pull him from a cache, basically. And not really lose anything. Next up we have Typhoid Mary. It's a solid B tier card. Gets played in Sauron decks, gets played with Zero sometimes, gets played with Luke Cage, and it's decent in those decks. The Luke Cage deck isn't very high in the meta. The Sauron deck is, though. This is probably the third or fourth, maybe fifth best card in that deck, and therefore not a high priority buy for new players, but it is a good card. Does need to have its ongoing effect mitigated most of the time to be good, and therefore requires other cards such as Zero or Sauron to take full advantage of it, or Luke Cage. Luke Cage now is a pool 3 card, more accessible. But the Luke Cage deck still isn't that good, and so Typhoid Mary's solid, but nothing special. Next up we have Wong. Wong is another solid B tier card. The Wong deck is actually a deck that I see recommended to new players fairly often. Or at least 1 or 2 months ago he was, with like the Wong going Spectrum deck. I don't recommend him for new players at all because he's very easy to counter. You play Wong and the opponent has options. Your opponent can play Arrow, which is everywhere in the meta right now, to pull cards away from your Wong lane, or the opponent can play Enchantress. If they're running Serum Miracle, they can play Cosmo, which is run often in the Shuri Zero deck. Very easy to counter, and not so easy to know when you're going to get countered. So he costs you cubes when he does get countered, and he really doesn't get 4 or 8 cube wins against players very often, at least. He may against bots, I'm not sure, but I wouldn't recommend this deck for newer players. I think it's a lower tier deck just because of how easy it is to counter. So I'd go for the Spectrum Destroyer or the Patriot Ultron or the Deathwave over a Wong going or a Wong on reveal type deck. So we're into the 5-cost cards now, and the first up is the Terror of the Ladder Arrow. Terror of the Ranked Ladder, currently featured in nearly every deck that's worth anything. She was nerfed from 5.8 to 5.7, hasn't really made any difference. Probably the best pool 3 card in the game. Not much else I can say about her except that you will see her all the time. You will probably play her all the time. She's not featured in Patriot Ultron or Spectrum Destroyer, but certainly featured prominently in Deathwave and featured prominently in Thanos. I think she's in most Shuri Zero decks. She's in... You could stick her into nearly any deck and it would make the deck better, including probably Spectrum Destroyer, to be honest. You could put Arrow in there. So, if you want to play Patriot Ultron, you don't need to buy her. Nearly everything else, you're going to want her as soon as possible. And so if you're considering buying any cards at all with tokens, Arrow's a very good option. You will see her ad nauseum and wish that you had her if you don't. Now, the one thing to consider is that she may get nerfed, and unlike Hearthstone, when cards are nerfed, you don't get a refund in this game. So, if she gets nerfed, you're out of luck if you buy her, unfortunately. And I think she is on the watch list for cards to get nerfed. So she might. In fact, there's a good chance, because she allows you to outplay far more powerful and expensive cards. And the developers don't seem to want that. They seem to want their powerful and expensive cards to win. And they seem to be unhappy with cards like Arrow and Leader, which are Pool 3 cards, the old Leader. Pool 3 cards that could defeat more powerful cards. Developers don't seem to be too happy about that, and so Arrow, I would guess she'll get nerfed, but that's only my guess. As of right now, probably one of the best cards in the game, probably the best Pool 3 card in the game. And you don't need her if you're building Patriot Ultron, but if you're building Deathwave, you certainly do. You don't need her for Spectrum Destroyer, though I think she could be good in that deck. And you certainly need her for Deathwave. So we go from Arrow to Black Bolt. I've seen Black Bolt played recently in the Stature deck. I've yet to see a good Stature list. I don't think Black Bolt is good, but I'm not putting him in F tier because I'm open to the possibility that he could be good in a Stature deck. And just because I've yet to see that deck doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I think it might exist, and so I'm not putting Black Bolt in the F tier, but I'm certainly not recommending anybody buy him. Next up we have Captain Marvel, a solid B tier card. It's one of my favorite cards, but not because it's really powerful, but because it's a lot of fun to play. It steals wins when you didn't think you were going to get one sometimes, or you can plan some kind of tricky plays based around it. And it's good in the Hela deck, which is one of my favorites, though it's not especially strong. But I think she's a solid B tier card, and she's got a place not only in Hela discard, but also in some control decks. But not a card that I recommend buying. Just a fun card to play, and fairly strong, but she belongs kind of lower down the B tier. Next up we have Dr. Octopus. This is kind of a C plus, B minus card. It's funny when it works. It's frustrating when it doesn't work. A lot of times you seem to pull Shang-Chi from the opponent's hand, and so Doc Ock kills himself. He's got a strong role in the Galactus deck, and he does have a place in some other control decks. Not a card I'd recommend buying, but he can be fun, and he can even be good in some control lists. Certainly not a plug-and-play card. Next we got Jane Foster, one of my personal favorites. She belongs in the B tier along with Thor. The Lockjaw with Jane Foster and Thor is a very good deck. Jane Foster is also quite good in the Mr. Negative deck I was running for a while, but Leech was giving it major problems. So the Mr. Negative Mighty Thor deck is probably always going to be one of my favorites. I look forward to the day that Leech isn't so prominent in the meta and combo decks can be run again. As of right now, she's just really good in the Lockjaw deck, but not particularly good in Mr. Negative. A solid B tier card, a card you would buy if you were aiming to play Lockjaw, Thor, Mighty Thor. And I see players making it to Infinite with that deck every season. I liked my version with Dracula, but I never tried the Mighty Thor deck because I don't have Thor. I will try it when I get Thor. For now, I think the Dracula deck is quite good, but Jane Foster, a solid B tier card, not likely to move up or down too much, though I could imagine a scenario if it becomes possible to play her after she's been inverted in the Mr. Negative deck somehow, through cost reduction or cheating her out somehow or something like that, then she'll get elevated, I think. But other than that, she's a solid B tier card. Next up we have Magic, a card featured prominently in two decks right now. There's a Magic Infinite deck that I see people doing well with, and she's featured in Mr. Negative, which is struggling due to Infinite. The Magic Infinite deck probably does a little bit. Now she's struggling in Mr. Negative. The Mr. Negative deck is struggling because of Leech. But the Magic Infinite deck does a little bit better against Leech because Infinite actually likes to be leeched. But She-Hulk does not, and the Magic She-Hulk Infinite combo relies on She-Hulk not getting leeched, and so it's unfortunate, but at the moment anything that's not good against Leech just isn't very good because Leech is very common. Look forward to the day that isn't the case because I do like combo decks. I think combo decks are more fun to play than just play the card with the big number and see whose number is bigger. So I look forward to the return of combo decks. But as of right now, Magic's a good card in the Magic Infinite deck or in the Mr. Negative deck. It's just those decks have a tough time with Leech. But I think the Magic Infinite deck is pretty good against bots because bots don't really see the Infinite She-Hulk play coming. And so you can take them for 8 cubes and just try to break even or maybe grind out a cube profit against players. But not a high priority buy. I have this as a solid B card. Next up we have Nick Fury. I can't imagine a reason to recommend buying Nick Fury. Have played him in a deck. I didn't think he was anything special. Add 3 random 6 cost cards to your hand. I suppose he could be played with MODOK or something like that if you were going to MODOK on turn 6 and you already had everything else set up. the 3 random 6 cost cards, you could pull something good and unexpected that wins you a game from time to time. But yeah, I wouldn't buy Nick Fury. It's possible at some point in the future there's a good deck that runs him, but I think it's unlikely. I don't think this card is very good. And we go from that to Red Skull, one of the best cards in the game, a card that you could slot 0 and Red Skull into almost any deck, and that deck would be better. Red Skull is so strong because of his 15 power. You play him with 0, and that is 6 cost for 18 power. That is incredibly strong. Until 0 gets nerfed, if 0 gets nerfed, this card is going to be all over the meta because it's one of the strongest turn 6 plays that you can make, and it doesn't take much to set it up. At its worst, it's like a 5-7 if you play him at a lane where the opponent has 4 cards and he gives each of those +2 power. But when used with Shuri, he's a 5-30 and his downside doesn't really matter. When used with 0, the two of them are 6 cost, 18 power. Very, very, very strong card. Don't recommend buying him with tokens, though, for new players, because the decks that run Red Skull, typically you have to buy so many cards that you won't be able to do it with the tokens that you enter Pool 3 with. But he's going to be a card that you're really, really going to want as early as possible. And I don't really see that changing, though it's possible that it will if 0 gets nerfed, but even if 0 got nerfed to 0 power, it would still be 6 cost for 15 power with 0, and that would still be really good. So Red Skull's not going anywhere. Very, very strong card. And the only reason I'm not recommending new players to buy it is because the decks that really run him, to complete those decks, you have to buy more cards than you'll be able to afford as you enter Pool 3. Next up we have Ronan the Accuser. I've yet to see a good Ronan the Accuser deck. I'm open to the possibility of it existing. It is usually unexpected when it gets played, which is probably the best thing I can say about it. His buff seems similar to the Dino, except that you can't control it, because there are a few cards that add cards to your opponent's hand. There's only Maximus, which is a good card, and Baron Mordo, which is not. So if there were more ways to control how many cards were in your opponent's hand, then perhaps this card would be good, but even so, your opponent's typically going to have the opportunity to empty their hand on turn 6. It's hard to imagine a deck with Ronan being really, really strong. Hard to imagine a deck with Ronan ever being stronger than a Dino deck. So I would have this as a fun card, and definitely not a high priority buy, but he does have surprise factor, and so conceivably there's a deck with him that'll be good. But I don't think I've seen that deck yet that I can recall. Certainly not a card I'd recommend for newer players spend their tokens on. Next up we have Serra. Serra's fallen off a little bit with the nerf of Silver Surfer, but it's still very, very strong. And the Serra Miracle deck is a very good deck. Now, it's not one of my recommended decks for new players because it gets hit heavily by Leech, unfortunately. The whole idea with the Serra Miracle is that you generate a turn 6 miracle by playing a bunch of cards on turn 6 and reversing your board position. But you can't do that when your hand gets leeched on turn 5. So, the Serra Miracle deck, not one I'd recommend going for. Leech, if and when Leech falls out of the meta, Serra Miracle will have a much more prominent place. But as of right now, Serra's not a recommended buy. She really doesn't see play outside of the Serra Miracle deck. I would have had her as an A or even an S tier card in the Silver Surfer meta, but that's behind us, and so now, not a recommended buy. The last of the 5 cost cards is a solid S tier card. That would be Taskmaster. Set this card's power equal to the power of the last card you played. I would refer to it as a duplicating effect. and one of the strongest in the meta right now. It gets used to duplicate the Red Skull after the Shuri buff a lot. Sometimes it duplicates the Red Skull just after you've played Red Skull all by himself. That's still 5 cost for 15 power. That's crazy good. He gets used to duplicate Venom sometimes, gets used for even a 10. Even if he just duplicates a 10 power card, that's still pretty good. This is an exceptional card, and he's not going anywhere. Any doubling effect like this is always going to have a strong place in the meta, and I would not recommend him for brand new players because there isn't really a deck you can run with him that you can afford with the 3,000 tokens you get entering Pool 3. But he is a very, very good card, one of the best in the game. And he's going to be a staple of the meta for a very long time if he stays in his current form. On to the 6 cost cards, and the first up is Agatha Harkness. 6 cost for 14 power, which is very good, but she starts in your hand and plays your cards for you, and she plays them very poorly. However, there is a deck that features Agatha Harkness that I think is capable of making it to infinite, which it uses Wave, because if Agatha has the option of playing herself, she will always take it. So if you wave on turn 3, or if Agatha waves on turn 3, because that's the only 3 cost card in your hand, then she will play herself on turn 4, and then you'll gain control of your deck again, and you'll have a 6 cost 14 power card on the table. The deck that runs her is decent. It's not a top tier deck, but it's a fun one, and it's like a 4th tier deck. But I can't recommend anybody buy her. I'll be happy when I get her along with Ghost Rider, and I'll play that deck a little bit. I think it'll be fun. I don't expect it to be very strong, though. But she's fun. Lady Sif is also featured in that deck, so that Lady Sif discards the Agatha, and then you regain control of your deck, and you bring her back with Ghost Rider or something like that. This is a fun card, and it's not unplayable, but certainly not one that I would recommend anybody buy. Next up, we have Arnim Zola. Arnim Zola is a duplicating effect, and thus will always have a place in the meta. The duplicating and cost reduction effects always will, unless something about the mechanics of the game change drastically. As of right now, it sometimes gets played in Shuri Zero decks, but not always. I think the top one doesn't usually play Zola. So he's not a recommended buy, even if you're going for Shuri Zero. But he is always going to have a place in the meta, and he's a very good card. Because that duplicating effect, well, it provides strong potential for combos, but as I said a few times in this video, combo decks are not good right now due to Leech, and I think that's why Zola got dropped from the Shuri Zero deck. If Leech left the meta, I think he would come back into the Shuri Zero deck pretty quickly. Also gets played in along with Black Panther. In fact, that's the most common use of him, although that combo, everybody sees it coming from a mile away, and so Arrow is a terror for Arnim Zola as well, and that's probably another reason why he's not seen too much, because Leech and Arrow are so common at the moment. But I do expect Arnim Zola to come in and out of the meta. He's always going to have a place in the meta. As soon as Leech leaves, he'll come back. Just not a recommended buy right now. Next up, we have Death, a solid S tier card, one you will absolutely need if you want to play Death Wave, which is an excellent option for early Pool 3, as you can acquire all the cards you need for 4,000 tokens, which is just 1,000 more than what you start with. Death also sees play in a few other decks. The deck that I play with Dracula and Lockjaw, I ran Death, provides an excellent option against Deathwave decks, as well as with certain locations like Lamentis 1 or the Collapsed Mine. A very, very solid card, not going anywhere. Deathwave's been tier 3 forever, it's probably going to be tier 3 forever. Every season players will get to infinite playing Deathwave because of how well it performs against the bots. Very good card. And Deathwave, if I were entering Pool 3, Deathwave is probably the deck I would go for. I would probably play Dino until I got Deathwave, or it's possible that I might grab Daredevil and Destroyer and play the Spectrum Destroyer, but I'd probably go for Deathwave. Speaking of Spectrum Destroyer, Destroyer is next on the list. A solid B tier card. Used to be 6 cost and 16 power. Got nerfed a little bit. He was terrorizing the meta when he was 16 power back in the beta. He destroys your other cards, so you've got to play using Professor X to lock down a lane. You've got to play using Armor or Cosmo to block his on reveal or something like that. But that 15 power for 6 cost is hard to beat. Hard to beat. Now, I think the deck probably will struggle against Shuri Zero, the Spectrum Destroyer ongoing, but everything does. Still, one of the top 3 decks that I recommend for newer players, and so I can recommend to buy this card if you want to play the Spectrum Destroyer, because you could get away with only buying Destroyer. It's the cheapest of the 3 decks that I recommend for newer players to Pool 3. The Patriot Ultron requires really 3,000 tokens, the Deathwave 4,000. The Spectrum Destroyer, you can get away with just 1,000, and you'll at least be able to get some of the ranked rewards. And if you've got the time and some skill, you can even get to infinite with it. But it'll be a grind, but it is cheap. So a very, very good option when you enter Pool 3. Just buy Destroyer. Play Spectrum Destroyer until you get other cards, and you'll get some of the ranked rewards. At least some of them. Next up we have Doctor Doom, another solid B tier card. It gets played a lot, primarily in Electro Ramp decks, some other decks which try to project power to other lanes, some control decks. He's very good in those decks. He's not quite as good as you would expect at first glance. At first glance, it looks like 6 cost for 15 power. In practice, that's rarely the case, because usually you only really want the power at 2 and sometimes only 1 lane. Sometimes you're only playing Doctor Doom to really add power to a lane that's hard to reach. So I'd say most often he's 6 cost for 10 power, which really isn't that good because one of the lanes you've already lost due to being really far behind. When he's good, he's really, really good. Most often he's okay. But he's got a solid place in the meta in the Electro Ramp deck, and I think there's 1 or 2 other control decks that run him. Not a recommended buy for newer players. Not a card that I would expect to buy and really dominate with. But he's good. Next up we have Giganto. It's a C tier card. I run him in my Dracula deck, and he's good in that deck. And he wins games sometimes because players don't expect the 14 power in the left lane. But in terms of the priority, when I would buy him, he's probably upper C tier, but not going to be a card that I recommend buying. You could easily, any deck that runs Giganto, you could get away with running the Hulk and not notice a difference most of the time. There might be a game occasionally where the extra 2 power would have won you the game. But most of the time you can get away with just running the Hulk or Magneto if you have him or something like that. So he doesn't get ranked very high. Next up we have Hela, one of my personal favorites, and the Hela deck has always been reasonable, but it's a tier below something like Deathwave. It requires some practice to learn it. It's a very tilting deck at times, very swingy. I've never been able to build a version that would get me to infinite yet, but I don't have Ghost Rider. I'll keep trying because I love the deck. When I get Ghost Rider, I'll certainly play it more, but it's certainly not a top tier deck. It's a fun deck. So you'd buy Hela and the cards that go with Hela if you want to play a fun gambly deck, but you do have to buy a lot of cards to get you there. The perfect Hela deck requires a lot of Pool 3 cards. It's very cost intensive, and so definitely not something I'd recommend that newer players go for, but I enjoy the deck a lot, and I do think there's a version of it that gets to infinite with reasonable consistency. Next up we have Helicarrier. I don't think much of this deck, even with MODOK. When you discard this from your hand, add 3 random cards to your hand. That can help you with MODOK to buff Morbius more. Um, that combo is kind of niche, though. I don't think it's that good. It probably goes on the higher end of the D tier, but it is D tier. I don't recommend buying it. Even if you want to play a MODOK deck, you can easily get away with not having Helicarrier. So, in my opinion, not worth spending tokens on. Next, we have Leader. He is now a 6/7. Copies all cards your opponent played to the location right of here. But on your side, he used to be an S tier card. He is now an F tier card. I do not recommend anyone buy him. I have never seen Leader played against me where it won my opponent the game. I'm not fully ruling out the possibility of that happening. The only way I can see Leader being really good is if, like, Elysium is out and you've got Daredevil in your deck. But apart from that, Leader's not good. He's really not good. I wish he was, because he would eliminate Shuri Zero from the game, I think. His old version, but the new version, no. This is not a card that I would recommend buying, unfortunately, because I did like the old Leader, though I know a lot of players did not. Found it frustrating to play against. And I probably would have been the same if he were a Series 4 or a Series 5 card, but I was in favor of the design philosophy of creating cards in Series 3 that could defeat more powerful and more expensive cards if they're played well. And Leader certainly fulfilled that role. And now that he's gone from the game, the Series 4 card Shuri and the Series 5 card Thanos are terrorizing the meta. Next up we have Magneto, a solid A minus B plus card. He wins a lot of games, and he wins 8 cube games, which is very important because he wins lanes unexpectedly by moving 3 or 4 cost cards when the opponent didn't necessarily expect that you would. He's not a card that I recommend buying because most of the good decks that run Magneto require you to buy a lot of cards. But he's very solid. He probably belongs like at the end of tier A, maybe tier B. He's probably like a B plus card. I'll put him in A, like A minus B plus. He'll win you 8 cube games, and that's important. The surprise factor is very important. And next we have She-Hulk, a solid S tier card. Any card which allows for cost reduction of more than 2 or duplicates is always going to be very, very solid. It's always going to be hovering around the meta, if not necessarily at the top of the meta, as with Zola or Absorbing Man, though I do believe there will be points in the game when those cards are at the top of the meta. The She-Hulk, the cost reduction is fantastic, and this is a very, very solid card. Featured in a wide variety of decks, and could be a card that you'll want to buy at some point, though not when you first enter into, well, Pool 3, unless you're going for Deathwave, in which case this will be one of the 4 cards I recommend buying. But if you're going for one of the others, Spectrum Destroyer or Patriot Ultron, then you don't need She-Hulk. But for Deathwave, yes, this is a very important card for Deathwave. Deathwave probably isn't playable without it, or at least gets a lot worse. So a good card to buy for early Pool 3 players. And last but not least is Ultron. 6 cost 8 power, creates 4 1-power drones at each other location. I've been running it with Dazzler and enjoying that. Along with Patriot and Mystique, this is a very powerful and relatively simple deck to play, though don't expect it to just carry you to infinite easily. It's still going to be a grind of 100 to 130 hours. And probably a boring one because the deck kind of gets stale to play. But it's good, and it's been good for a long time, and it's probably going to continue being good. Because these drones that he creates don't have an ability, and therefore they get the Patriot buff. play Patriot Mystique, they get +4. Patriot Mystique Blue Marvel gets +5 to each drone. And so the Patriot Ultron deck beats bots for 8 cubes and can grind out a cube profit against other players, or at least break even. Though it's still going to be a long grind to get to high ranks. It's going to require you to spend 3,000 tokens, and Spectrum Destroyer really only requires 1,000, or maybe 2 if you want to add Daredevil. Still, one of the top 3 decks I'd recommend for players new to Pool 3. So that's going to be all of the Pool 3 cards. Once again, the decks that I recommend are Deathwave, Patriot Ultron, and Spectrum Destroyer. Just depends on how many tokens you want to spend. Deathwave costs 4,000, Patriot Ultron 3, and Spectrum Destroyer 1 if you just buy Destroyer, or possibly 2 if you buy Destroyer and Daredevil. And I do recommend spending those tokens if you really want the ranked rewards right away. If you can live with just breaking even for a while, not really getting anywhere, well, then don't spend the tokens and save them up for Kang or Thanos or Galactus, because those cards are never getting discounted. So it's up to you, the player, to decide on what your goals for the game are, and keep in mind that there are no guarantees. Even if you follow the guide, my guidelines that I've laid out, you may not make it to infinite. In fact, you probably won't, because I think currently something like, 2 to 5% of players get to infinite, and most of that is just because of the time constraint. 100 hours, 100 to 130 hours in 1 month of gameplay is no joke. And if you ask me if it'd be worth it if I wasn't running a YouTube channel, probably not. Probably not, it would not be worth it, but I enjoy playing the game and sharing the videos with other players, so that part of it is worth it. But the infinite grind, it is a grind. It's way more of a grind than Hearthstone ever was for me. But if that is your goal, then I respect it. It's certainly my goal every month, and hopefully these deck recommendations will help get you at least a little closer to those ranked rewards. So, thank you for watching.